out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your Pest Geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube. We're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Stephen Van Tassel with today's topic.
Thanks, Frank. Stephen Van Tassel here, wildlife control consultant, bringing you another episode of The Wildlife. Wanted to talk today a little bit about toxicants. Toxicants are basically poisons that are used to control various types of pest organisms. So, because my specialty is vertebrates, of course, so we're going to talk about rodenticides primarily because rodents are a significant source of pests that impact human health and structures and safety, and sometimes they're just a nuisance, but they can be a significant problem. So we want to talk about understanding rodenticides, so we're going to take a little bit of time and do a little bit of overview, and then in future podcasts I want to drill down into specific active ingredients so that we have a better understanding of what we're using and how sometimes we're not using it really the way we should be using them. So hopefully this will help you become a better PCO or wildlife control operator. A lot of wildlife control operators don't have pesticide licenses. I think that's a mistake. Even if you don't plan on using toxicants right now as a part of your business, I encourage all wildlife control operators take the time, take the effort, get your pesticide license, so at least you can use rodenticides around structures. Because you never know, there are going to be situations where rodenticides can help your business. I have a colleague who makes a significant portion of his income in the wintertime when things are slow where he lives. He lives in kind of the frozen north where there's tons of snow, and he keeps his business going just refilling bait stations during the wintertime for clients who are having issues with voles and other rodents that are around structures. So it can be a way to help your business to generate revenue without always having to trap or exclude. So let's talk a little about rodenticides. So a rodenticide, of course, are toxicants, pesticides that kill rodents. So rodent, everyone knows what that word means, and side means to kill. So these are products that are designed to kill rodents. And so let's talk about the major categories of rodenticides. So when we're talking about baits, these are things that are consumed by rodents. They fall into two major categories: anticoagulants and non-anticoagulants. So anticoagulants, as the name suggests, fights the coagulation of our blood. So these are products that cause the capillaries and the coagulating factors in blood to break down and no longer work, so that the rodents are suffering from hemorrhaging, which is a fancy word for bleeding. And they're often bleeding internally at the vascular level, and occasionally you will see blood coming out in their stool or through their orifices like their nose. Although that's not very common, although there may be some bloody stool. A lot of the bleeding that occurs is at the vascular level in their capillaries, which are really tiny veins and arteries. Capillaries are the last spot to where the blood goes till it reaches the cellular level. And that's where the breakdown often occurs. So if you cut one of these animals open, make sure you're wearing your PPE, of course, you will just see massive red because the blood is just going everywhere in that organism's body. The other category of rodenticides is the non-anticoagulant. And so the mode of action, that is how the product kills, uses a means that's not related to the coagulation of blood. And that is going to vary depending on the product. So it's basically a garbage can category. So either it causes bleeding in the organism, as the anticoagulants do, or it kills by another means. And there are several means that it uses. So let's talk briefly about about the individual products. We're talking only about the active ingredients here, not specific brand names. Okay, that can be maybe for a later conversation. But we're just talking about the active ingredients that are used in the rodenticides. So let's talk about the anticoagulants first. Within the category of anticoagulants, there are two other categories that subdivide the category of anticoagulant, and that is known as first generation anticoagulant rodenticides, with the acronym FGAR for first generation anticoagulant rodenticide. And then, of course, if you have first, then you likely have a second. Then you have the SGARs, that's the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. So we have rodenticides, and then two subcategories, anticoagulant, non-anticoagulant. Now, within the anticoagulant category, it breaks down into two further categories of first-generation anticoagulant rodenticide and second-generation anticoagulant rodenticide. So let's talk about those specific products within those particular categories. So within the first-generation anticoagulant, they're called first-generation because they are generally older than the second generation. These products are called, the names are warfarin, chlorofazanone, and difazanone. So warfarin is one of the oldies. It's even used on humans today in terms of trying to keep our blood thin when people are having issues with clotting. Maybe they've had a stroke or heart condition where they need to reduce the clotting factor of a person's blood. So it's, people call it, oh, you're taking rat poison. Yeah, and it's kind of, everyone laughs. And it's kind of true because remember, the dose makes the poison. So in small quantities, under physician direction, warfarin is an important medicine. Actually, it's used to help people extend their lives and improve their well-being. But when we use it as a rodenticide, it is used to kill rats and mice as they're consuming it. So warfarin is an old one. Chlorofazanone, used by Leafitech. They use a lot of products in warfarin. That's also a first-generation anticoagulant. And, of course, difazanone, which is used often by Symetrics out of Colorado. That is also a first-generation anticoagulant. So what are some of the characteristics of first-generation anticoagulants? First-generation anticoagulants are known as multi-feed toxicants. Now what that means is that the rodent has to feed on the product multiple times in order to get a toxic dose. Now that may seem counterintuitive to you. Say, why do we want to use a product where the rodent has to eat more in order to get a toxic dose? Well, understand if the product takes more time to kill the animal, then the animal is less likely to get what's known as aversive conditioning. So, for example, aversive conditioning means that if you eat something and it makes you sick, you often avoid that particular food group again. For example, if you went to a restaurant and you ordered a meal and you were throwing your guts up later that night, it is very unlikely that you will go back to that restaurant again. Why? Because you associated that vomiting experience with your last meal. That's aversive conditioning. So then you learned from that, and you now have aversive conditioning toward that particular restaurant. Well, rodents are the same way. If the effects of a rodenticide are too fast, the rodent will then learn to avoid that particular product. So with warfarin and chlorphacinone and diphacinone, the rodent has to feed on it multiple times in order to achieve a toxic dose. Now here's the interesting thing about rodenticides, about these particular rodenticides that a lot of people don't quite understand. They are actually more toxic at small doses over time than if you ate a lot at once. Now that's kind of weird. Why would the product, in other words, if the rat ate a bunch of warfarin at one sitting and then didn't eat any more, it would be harder to kill the rat than if the rat ate a nibble on day 1 and a nibble on day 2 and maybe a nibble on day 3? The answer is yes. Because the way these products work is they interfere with the clotting factor within the body. And if you eat too much at once, maybe your body has some sort of defensive mechanism to it, so that it just doesn't overwhelm it as much. But a little bit each day is actually more toxicant for the rodent than if the rodent ate a lot. Now, why is that important to mention? Because this is the problem when we look at what's called the LD50. Now, a lot of you are probably familiar with LD50. It's the lethal dose 50%. Now, what that means is it's the amount of material that an animal needs to eat in order for 50% of the population, the test population, to die. Now, the quantity, the volume is evaluated on the basis of a milligram per kilogram. Now, we don't use metric system that much in the United States, so it can be a bit confusing when you hear that. What's a milligram? What's a kilogram? Well, a kilogram is about 2.2 pounds, and a milligram is 1/1,000,000th of a kilogram. So if you take 2.2 pounds and divide it up into 1,000,000 parts, each one of those parts is 1 milligram. So the ratio that's used for LD50 is the ratio of milligrams per kilogram. How many milligrams of toxicant is needed to kill an animal based on the number of kilograms in that organism at a ratio of a milligram per kilogram? Now, obviously, most rodents are less than 2.2 pounds. So if you're dealing with something like a rat, it's a pretty big rat to even become close to the weight of a pound. So we're talking about some very small quantities of poison necessary to kill a particular rodent. That's why when you look at the active ingredients, the active ingredient is 0.005%. Really small quantities. And so the rodent doesn't need to eat that much each day to get a toxic dose. But that LD50 means that that LD50 is based on how much that rodent has to eat in one sitting to kill 50% of the test population. So if you have 20 rodents, the researchers feed those rodents a single dose of poison, and then when they find that 50% die, they then evaluate how much poison was needed at a ratio of milligrams to kilograms to kill that 50% of the rodent population. So really, really small amounts, but it's, again, a single dose. But when we look at how rodenticides work, however, we don't need a single dose. So a little bit of toxicant each day over several days for this first generation anticoagulant is all that's necessary to kill rodents. Why am I hammering away at this point so hard? It's because a lot of people think you have to use a second generation anticoagulant to get good control on rodents. It's simply not true. Are there rodents that have resistance to first generation anticoagulants? Yes, but resistance doesn't mean immune. But I'm going to put that aside for a moment and get back to that LD50 again. So the LD50, when they do those tests, those are what's called acute poisoning tests. How much poison's needed in one dose to kill 50% of the population. Now what that also means is 50% of the population survive. So the LD50 just gives us sort of an average. There are some problems with that LD50 ratio, but it's what we have, and you just have to understand that there are limitations to it, but also that 50% of that test population survive. So one of the downsides of first generation anticoagulants is that you have to apply more bait to kill the same number of rodents. Why is that? Well, because the rodents have to feed on the bait multiple times to get a toxic dose. So one reason why I suspect many PCOs don't like to use first generation anticoagulants is that they have to check the bait stations more frequently, because if the bait stations go empty and the rodent has not consumed enough toxicant to get a toxic dose, the rodent will get sick and associate the illness with the fact they've been eating that poison, and then you have an educated rodent. So this is why when you read rodenticide labels that using first generation anticoagulants, they will repeatedly say, do not let your bait stations go empty. Maintain a sufficient amount of bait in those stations to ensure that you kill the population that you're trying to kill. Because if it goes empty and that rodent didn't eat enough, then the rodent will survive. And now you have an educated rodent. And I hope as PCOs and wildlife control operators, the last thing we want in life is an educated rodent. Okay? Because then that becomes very difficult to control. It also takes more time to kill rodents with first generation anticoagulants. You may say, well, I'm a PCO. My customers want fast service. I need to knock this population down immediately. Well, I understand that, but you also need to understand how much time are you actually saving? 1 day. Yeah, that's right. You heard it. 1 day. Because second generation anticoagulants don't kill immediately. And this is the dirty secret that people don't think about when they think about second generation anticoagulants. So it takes 3 to 4 days to kill a rodent with first generation anticoagulants. It takes 2 to 3 days to kill a rodent with first generation anticoagulants. With second generation anticoagulants. 1 day. Big whoop. Do you think your client really notices? No, not really. So you don't need to use second generation anticoagulants just for speed purposes. It's just simply not true. If the rodents are eating the bait, if the bait is good and the rodents like it, you save about a day. The advantage of first generation anticoagulants is that they are safer in terms of secondary poisoning. Now, a lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with secondary poisoning. Secondary poisoning is when the rodent eats the toxicant and then another animal eats the rodent. What is the effect of the poison in that rodent have on the predator that ate the rodent? That's secondary poisoning. Research is coming out is finding that the second generation anticoagulants are far more persistent in the pest species, and that's becoming a risk for the scavengers and the carnivores that are eating the rodents. So this is why there's a push for reducing the amount of secondary of second-generation anticoagulants in the environment because of how persistent, and we're talking about orders of magnitude more persistent. Because remember, when a rodent consumes a rodenticide, its metabolism is beginning to break that toxicant down. First-generation anticoagulants are broken down, as a rule, faster than second-generation anticoagulants. So it's called the half-life, how much time is needed to reduce the amount of toxicant in that organism to 50%. That's known as the half-life, is significantly shorter in first generation than it is for second generation. Second generation anticoagulants, the half-lives can be weeks to months, where in first generation anticoagulants, the half-life is often days to weeks. And that's significant when we're dealing with secondary poisoning issues. All right, let's turn over to second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. Just like the first generation anticoagulant rodenticides are multiple feed, in other words, the rodent has to feed on it multiple times to get a toxic dose, second generation anticoagulant rodenticides only require the rodent to feed once. Now you may be thinking, that's what I want. I want the rodent to feed once and he's dead. Well, it's a little more complicated than that because yes, one dose for that rodent will give it a toxic dose. However, the rodent doesn't get just one dose because there's a delay factor for that rodenticide to affect the rodent. So the rodent goes to a second generation anticoagulant, feeds on day one, has a toxic dose, but the effect of that toxic dose doesn't begin to hit the rodent till probably late on day 2 or late or early or day 3. So what does the rodent do on day 2? Goes back to that particular bait again, gets another dose. Now the rodent has twice as much toxicant as necessary to kill it. Now, what happens in real life, as you may know in terms of mice will revisit a location and feed multiple times every day. So now the mouse is getting maybe 3 or 4 doses of toxicant on day 1, maybe 3 or 4 doses of toxicant on day 2, and then starts feeling the effects on day 3. But the rodent has 4 to 6 times more toxicant, lethal toxicant in its body than necessary to kill it. Now, what do you think that does for secondary poisoning issues? The rodent has 4 times as much poison necessary to kill it, and that poison is more persistent in its metabolism, in its body, than a first-generation anticoagulant. So now you have a cat, you have an owl, you have a dog feeding on that dead and dying mouse, because remember, anticoagulants cause mice to be weak. They may not make it back to the den in time, their nest in time to die there. They may get caught out in the open where they're available to be consumed by scavengers and carnivores, and then they're fed on it. So now that owl is feeding on that sick mouse. He's like, oh, I got an easy snack here. Now the owl eats that mouse that has 4 to 5 times more toxicant in it than what it needs to kill the mouse. And so now the owl takes a dose. And then the owl takes another mouse on day 3 that was eating the toxicant. And then the owl on day 7, another mouse is sick and dying, and that owl eats it. So what do you think the cumulative effect of those secondary poisons are having on the owl? Now, granted, the owl is bigger. It takes more poison to kill bigger animals than smaller animals. The mouse has metabolized some of that toxicant before the owl eats it, but the owl is still getting those doses of second-generation anticoagulant in its system. And the research is showing some scary things about secondary rodenticide poisoning with scavengers and predators that are feeding on rodents. And the research has been enormous on this point. So I've been pretty negative here on second-generation anticoagulants. Now let me try to dial that back a little bit, because some of you may think you should never use second-generation anticoagulants, and I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that you, as a pest professional, need to be prudent and use products appropriately, not just simply going to the atom bomb to solve a problem. And that's sometimes we get lazy as PCOs. We just want to make fast money, move on, and not thinking about the long-term consequences of what we're doing. So where should you use second-generation anticoagulants? You need to use second-generation anticoagulants when you're in an environment that you can't control the amount of available food for the rodents. Let me give you an illustration. If you're trying to control a rodent population in a situation where there is so much food available, your bait is competing with alternative foods that cannot be reduced, you will probably need to use second-generation anticoagulants because you may only have one chance to kill that rodent. With first-generation anticoagulant rodenticides, the rodent has to feed multiple times to get a toxic dose. But if there's lots of food around, why would the rodent come back to your bait? So with second-generation anticoagulants, one dose, one meal by that rodent is enough to kill it. So even if the rodent goes to your second-generation anticoagulant, feeds on that rodenticide, takes off and begins eating grain or other foods, maybe you're just in a filthy place, and your client will not do anything to remove the available food, or the client is simply unable to remove the available food, then you're going to have to use a second-generation anticoagulant. That's all you got, unless you're going to be using traps. Of course, I don't want to eliminate other options there, because there are other options. But if you're going to use a rodenticide, you're going to have to probably choose a second-generation anticoagulant rodenticide. Okay, so that's the first-generation anticoagulant rodenticide as well as the second-generation anticoagulant rodenticide. So I didn't give you the list of second-generation anticoagulants, so let me give you that. Second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides include brodifacoum, bromadiolone, difenacoum, and difethalone. So let's go over the first-generation anticoagulant rodenticides: warfarin, chlorofazanone, difazanone. So you have 3 first-generation anticoagulant rodenticides, and you have 4 second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides. So the first generation again: warfarin, chlorofazanone, difazanone. Second-generation anticoagulants: brodifacoum, bromadiolone, difenacoum, and difethalone. All right, let's talk about the non-anticoagulants. As I said before, non-anticoagulant rodenticides kill rodents by means other than interfering with the coagulation of blood. We have 3 non-anticoagulant rodenticides available in the United States. Now, you go out overseas, you can get some other options, but in the U.S., we basically have 3. Those are bromethalin, cocalciferol, and zinc phosphide. Now, bromethalin affects the nerve tissue on a particular on the organism. So it doesn't affect the blood of the rodent. It affects their ability to transmit nerve signals. Now, one of the interesting things about bromethalin is that it's basically designed that once the rodent gets a toxic dose, the rodent doesn't consume any more bromethalin. So this is one of the reasons why bromethalin is available to the general public as an over-the-counter product that doesn't need a license to get. Cocalciferol is basically vitamin D, and it basically affects the organism's it affects the calcium levels in the rodent and causes a heart attack in that way. Cocalciferol is the only product allowed for organic farming. Now, a lot of people think that if something's organic, it must be safe. That is not true. So if you're telling your clients, oh, this is organic, this is registered for organic use, doesn't make it safe. Strychnine is quote-unquote organic, right? But it doesn't make it safe, right? So we never want to be calling rodenticides safe. So cocalciferol is a non-anticoagulant rodenticide, but it is allowed for use in organic areas. The last one is zinc phosphide. Zinc phosphide is used. It's an acute toxicant. It kills very quickly organisms that eat it. If you're familiar with aluminum phosphide, the fumigant, zinc phosphide is just the bait product. So when the animal eats it and it reaches the gastric juices, it liberates off phosphine gas and causes the body to shut down internally that way. Zinc phosphide, the beauty of zinc phosphide is there is no secondary poisoning risk by any practical means. There's some theoretical issues, and I don't want to get too far into the details there. But for all practical purposes, the zinc phosphide secondary poisoning risk is pretty small. However, it has an extraordinarily high primary toxicity risk. So you only need to eat a little bit to kill stuff. It is amazing how toxic it is. But in terms of, if a fox is eating the mice you kill with zinc phosphide, the fox will be fine. So that's one of the reasons why it's often used in agricultural situations. You may know of zinc phosphide as a tracking powder. So the tracking powder usually is at 5%. And the rodent goes through the tracking powder and then begins to groom itself, and that's how it consumes zinc phosphide. But zinc phosphide will persist for years. That's why it has to be placed behind walls and areas where people don't have access to it, because it is extraordinarily toxic. So those are the two main categories of rodenticides. We have the anticoagulant, non-anticoagulant, and then underneath the anticoagulant rodenticides, we have first-generation anticoagulant rodenticides, and we have second-generation anticoagulants rodenticides. And I talked a little bit about LD50, and then some of the pros and cons of first-generation and second-generation anticoagulants. I hope this helps you understand your products better so that you use them more effectively. Don't be a robot when you're using rodenticides. Choose your rodenticides wisely according to the situation that you're involved in. They work, but try to choose those that are going to have a less negative environmental impact while still taking care of the concerns that your client has for needing to control rodents in your particular situation. Hope that helps. Stephen Van Tassel, Wildlife Control Consultant. Back to you, Frank.
We hope you have enjoyed this edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. Until next time, have a pestacular day.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.